The psychology of doing nothing. I used to be terrified of silence, not the silence of an empty room, not the quiet after a storm. I mean the silence inside, that strange, uncomfortable stillness that creeps in the moment you stop moving, stop scrolling, stop filling every second with something. The moment you do, nothing. I remember the first time I truly tried it. I sat down on my couch on a Sunday afternoon. No phone, no music, no podcast playing in the background. Just me, the room, and whatever was left when all the noise was gone. I lasted 4 minutes. Then I grabbed my phone, opened an app I don't even like, and scrolled for 45 minutes without knowing why. That moment scared me more than the silence ever could. Why we can't stop. Here's what most people don't realize about the modern human brain. It was never designed for this much stimulation. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human mind existed in a world of relative quiet. Long stretches of nothing, walking, waiting, watching the horizon. Boredom wasn't a problem to solve. It was just part of being alive. Then, in the span of a single generation, we handed every person on Earth a device that delivers infinite novelty, infinite distraction, infinite stimulation, available at any moment, day or night. And our brains said yes, immediately, completely, without hesitation, because the brain is wired to seek. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with reward, is not actually released when you get something. It's released in anticipation of getting something. The search itself is the reward. And scrolling, clicking, refreshing. These are the perfect dopamine loops. They never end. There is always one more thing. So when you take that away, when you sit in a room with nothing, your brain doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like withdrawal. The discomfort is the data. In 2014, researchers at the University of Virginia conducted a study that became one of the most quoted and most uncomfortable findings in modern psychology. Participants were left alone in a room for 15 minutes with nothing to do. No phone, no reading material, just their thoughts. 2/3 of men and 1/4 of women chose to give themselves mild electric shocks rather than sit alone with their own minds. They preferred physical pain to mental stillness. When I first read that study, I laughed. Then I stopped laughing, because I understood it completely. Sitting with yourself, really sitting with yourself, means sitting with everything you've been avoiding, the conversation you haven't had, the decision you keep postponing, the feeling you buried under 12 hours of content consumption. The discomfort of doing nothing isn't emptiness, it's information. Your mind finally has the space to surface what you've been suppressing, and for most people, that is genuinely frightening. What your brain does when you let it rest. Here's where it gets interesting. Neuroscientists have identified a network in the brain called the default mode network, the DMN. For a long time, researchers assumed this network was inactive during rest, that when you weren't doing anything, your brain was essentially offline. They were wrong. The default mode network is most active precisely when you are doing nothing, when you are daydreaming, when you are staring at the ceiling, when you are sitting quietly without any external input. And what is it doing during those moments? It is consolidating memory, processing emotional experience, building empathy, running simulations of other people's inner lives, generating creative insight, constructing the narrative of who you are. In other words, the most important cognitive work your brain does happens not when you are focused, but when you are idle. Every time you interrupt that process with a notification, a video, a scroll, you are pulling your brain out of its most essential maintenance cycle. You are doing the neurological equivalent of never letting a wound close. The guilt of rest. But here's the part nobody talks about. Even when people understand this, even when they know rest is necessary, even when they accept the science, they still can't do it without guilt. Because we live in a culture that has turned productivity into a moral value. Busyness is not just a schedule. It is an identity. It is proof of worth. If you are busy, you matter. If you are resting, you are falling behind. If you are doing nothing, you are lazy, indulgent, irresponsible. Psychologist Brené Brown has written extensively about how the modern Western culture treats rest as something you have to earn. You rest after you've worked enough. You relax after you've been productive enough. You stop only when the to-do list says you can. But the to-do list never says you can. And so people carry chronic exhaustion like a badge of honor, mistaking collapse for dedication, mistaking burnout for ambition. The most radical thing you can do in a productivity-obsessed culture is to sit down in the middle of the day and do absolutely nothing, and feel no guilt about it whatsoever. Most people never get there. The art of doing nothing. The Italians have a phrase, dolce far niente, the sweetness of doing nothing, not the guilt of doing nothing, not the anxiety of doing nothing. The sweetness. The Japanese practice ma, the conscious appreciation of pause, of empty space, of the gap between things. In Japanese aesthetics, the silence between notes is as important as the notes themselves. These aren't just cultural quirks. They are ancient intuitions about something modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm. Rest is not the absence of productivity. It is a different kind of productivity. One that happens below the surface, in the quiet, in the spaces between doing. When you let your mind wander, truly wander without redirecting it, it begins to make connections you couldn't force. Solutions appear that hours of focused effort couldn't produce. Emotions settle into clarity. The noise separates from the signal. This is why the best ideas rarely come at a desk. They come in the shower, on a walk, in that half-awake state just before sleep. Your brain was solving the problem the whole time. You just had to get out of the way. Doing nothing is not passive. It is one of the most active things a human mind can do. It requires courage to sit with yourself without distraction, without performance, without productivity as a shield. It requires trust that your mind, when given space, knows what to do with it. And it requires something our culture has almost entirely forgotten how to give itself. Permission. If this resonated with you, put your phone down for 5 minutes after this ends. Just sit. See what shows up.